The wind came down off the Bitterroot Mountains like a living thing that morning, cold, sharp, whispering through the pine as if the land itself remembered old ghosts. A hawk circled high above the valley, crying into the silence, while the only man in sight rode slowly down the wagon trail that wound between frozen creeks and scattered aspens. Silas Boone had been riding since dawn. His coat, once Union blue but long since faded to a muddy gray, flapped against his saddle. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a beard like winter thistle and eyes the color of wet slate, steady, unhurried, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and told nothing. A rifle lay slung across his back. His revolver hung loose on his hip. The mountain man had spent too many years alone up in the ridges, where men spoke little and silence said enough. He rode an old mare named Clover. She limped slightly, her coat dull from age and the hard winters they'd survived together. Silas had decided to trade her for a new horse, one with stronger legs, one that could handle the long trails north. Word in the valley said Eli McKinney's ranch had some good stock for sale, and though Silas didn't like the man's name, he didn't have much choice. The McKinney place sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by a crooked split rail fence and bare cottonwoods. The barn was big, red once but now peeling gray under the mountain wind. Silas dismounted, tied Clover near the corral, and gave her a pat on the neck. "You done your miles, old girl," he murmured, his voice low and rough from disuse. "We'll find you a warm place to rest." He pushed the barn door open. It groaned like something alive. Inside was dim and smelled of hay, leather, and manure, familiar scents that spoke of farm life, work, and time. Sunlight knifed through the slats, catching the dust in golden streaks. Horses shifted in their stalls, watching him with curious eyes. But what caught Silas's attention wasn't the horses. It was the silence, too quiet. No voices, no farmhands, no clatter of tools. Just a heavy, unnatural stillness. He called out once, "Hello, the barn." No answer came, only the uneasy shuffle of hooves. He moved forward, boots crunching over straw, the cold metal of his revolver already warm in his palm. He'd lived too long in wild country not to listen when something felt wrong. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A small muffled sob like a bird with a broken wing. It came from the far end of the barn, behind stacked hay bales and empty feed sacks. Silas's pulse quickened. He stepped quietly, pushing aside a wooden crate, then another. The smell changed. Less hay, more iron. Blood. And then he saw her. A young woman, half slumped against the post, wrists chained above her head with rough iron links. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen, her lips cracked. Her dress was torn at the sleeve and caked with dirt. Her bare feet blue from cold. Yet even through the pain, her eyes caught his, the color of deep forest green, sharp and alive with fear and fury both. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other. Silas's voice came out low, steady. "Easy, ma'am. I ain't here to hurt you." She flinched, pulling back as far as the chains would let her. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice rasping like dry grass. He holstered his revolver slowly, showing his empty hands. "Who did this?" She looked down, her shoulders shaking. No answer. Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't wait for more. From his belt, he drew the long hunting knife he'd carried since the war and examined the lock on the chain, a crude thing, bolted through the post. It took only 2 hard strikes with the back of his knife before the wood splintered and the chain fell loose. The woman crumpled, weak from exhaustion. He caught her before she hit the ground, his big hands gentle beneath her shoulders. She tried to fight him off, but the effort only made her wince in pain. "Easy," he said again. "You're safe now." Her head fell against his chest, too tired to argue. Silas felt the faint rise and fall of her breathing. He lifted her, light as a child, and carried her toward the barn doors. Outside, the wind stung like needles. Clover nickered softly at his approach, ears twitching. Silas laid the woman carefully across the saddle and mounted behind her, steadying her limp form with one arm. Her pulse fluttered weakly against his wrist. He glanced once back at the house beyond the barn, shutters drawn, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Someone was home, maybe Eli McKinney himself. But Silas Boone wasn't a man to parley with devils. He turned his horse north and rode hard for the timberline. The trail was rough, climbing through pine shadows and narrow canyons. By dusk, the temperature had dropped. The woman hadn't spoken since they'd left the barn. Once she stirred and murmured something. "Please." "No more," and he'd felt his chest tighten with a quiet anger he hadn't felt in years. It was full dark when he reached his cabin, a small log shelter beside a rushing creek. Smoke still clung to the chimney from that morning's fire. He carried her inside and laid her on his bed, just a pile of furs and blankets, but warm. Then he lit the lamp and studied her by its flickering light. She was young, maybe 25. Pretty once, though now marred by bruises and dirt. The rope burns on her wrists told enough of her story, even if her lips stayed closed. He heated water on the stove, cleaned her wounds with the careful patience of a man who'd patched his own too many times. When he brushed her hair from her forehead, her eyes opened a crack. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My place," he said softly. "Up in the pines." "You're safe." Her gaze darted around, confused. You won't." He shook his head, voice firm. "No, ma'am. I don't hurt women. You got my word on that." Something in his tone, plain, unpolished, but honest, seemed to calm her. She looked at him for a long moment before her eyes closed again. Silas sat back in the chair by the fire, watching the flames lick the wood. He poured himself a tin of coffee, though he didn't drink it. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from fury barely contained. Whoever had done this to her was a coward, the kind of man he thought the mountains had long since swallowed. Outside, the wolves began to howl. The sound drifted down the ridge, wild and haunting. Silas stared into the fire until the coals burned low, his jaw set. He hadn't come looking for trouble, just a horse, just a simple trade and a quiet night. But sometimes fate didn't ask a man what he came for. Sometimes it handed him something broken and dared him to make it whole again. As the woman slept fitfully in his bed, Silas Boone made a quiet promise to the firelight. Whoever chained her up like an animal would answer for it. The mountains had a way of balancing debts, and this one, he swore, was coming due. Morning came slow over the mountains, gold light pushing through the tall pines and spilling across the little cabin by the creek. Frost still glazed the ground outside, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the stovepipe. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of coffee and pine wood. Silas Boone sat in his chair near the hearth, mending a torn bootlace, his eyes steady on the woman lying in his bed. She hadn't stirred since he brought her in last night, her skin pale, lips cracked, breath shallow but steady. He'd slept in the corner on a blanket, rifle within reach out of old habit. But his mind hadn't rested. Every time the fire cracked, his eyes went to her again, wondering who she was and what hell had put her in that barn. When she finally woke, it was with a sharp intake of breath. She sat up too fast, confusion flashing in her eyes as she looked around. "Easy," Silas said softly. "You're safe here." She flinched at his voice, pulling the blanket tight against her chest. Where am I?" "My cabin," he replied. "Up by Bear Creek, north of the valley. You've been out since last night." Her eyes darted toward the door like a cornered animal looking for a way out. "Why'd you bring me here?" "Because you were chained in a barn," he said simply, meeting her gaze. "And I couldn't leave you there." She looked down at her hands, at the red mark still raw on her wrists. When she spoke again, her voice cracked like dry wood. "He'll come for me." "Who?" "Eli McKinney." Her lip trembled slightly. "You shouldn't have touched me." "You don't know what he'll do." Silas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Lady, I've seen what men like him do. I've fought worse in war and worse after. He don't scare me." Her eyes flickered with something, fear, but also disbelief. For a moment, she studied the rough man before her. The lined face, the broad shoulders, the faded blue coat still smelling faintly of smoke and pine. "You'd risk your life for a stranger?" He shrugged. "Ain't about risk. It's about right." Silas rose and poured a cup of coffee, setting it on the small table beside her bed. She hesitated before taking it, hands trembling. The steam rose between them like a fragile truce. "Got a name?" he asked quietly. After a long silence, she nodded. "Clara Bennett." "Silas Boone," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Now we ain't strangers." Over the next few days, Clara slept often, her strength slowly returning. Silas kept to himself, chopping wood, hauling water, fixing traps along the ridge. Each evening, he'd bring in fresh meat or a bundle of wild herbs for tea. He never asked questions, and she never volunteered answers. But he saw the shadows in her eyes, the way she froze at sudden noises, the way she touched her wrist as if expecting the chain still there. Sometimes she'd wake screaming from dreams she couldn't finish. Silas never asked what they were about. He just set another log on the fire and sat close enough for her to know she wasn't alone. On the fourth morning, Clara stepped outside for the first time. The cold air bit her cheeks and the sunlight felt almost unreal after weeks in darkness. The cabin sat nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pine and birch, the sound of a rushing creek not far off. Silas was splitting wood near the edge of the clearing. His movements were steady, practiced, the rhythm almost soothing. She watched him for a while before speaking. "I thought mountain men were just stories," she said softly. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his beard. "We're quieter than most stories tell, that's all." "Why live out here?" He paused, setting down the axe. "Because the world down there got too loud, too cruel." She nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. "I used to think that way too, till the cruelty found me anyway." He said nothing, but his eyes softened. He handed her a canteen of water and motioned toward the creek trail. "Walk a bit. Sun'll do you good." That afternoon, while she was resting by the fire, Clara told him the truth. She and her husband had come west from Kansas 2 years ago, chasing land and luck. But he'd taken to whiskey and cards faster than farming. One night in a saloon, he lost a poker hand, and with it, her. "He said it was just a game," she whispered, staring into the fire. "But the man who won said he'd take his prize. I ran. They caught me by the old barn. The others walked away, but he kept me." Her hand shook. "He said no woman disobeys him twice." Silas's jaw clenched, the cords in his neck tightening. "That man McKinney?" She nodded, eyes glistening. "The same." Silas rose, pacing near the window. The muscles in his back rippled beneath his worn shirt, every inch of him coiled in fury. "You're telling me that bastard's still breathing?" Clara's voice trembled. "Please don't. He's got men. The sheriff owes him favors. He'll kill you." He turned toward her, voice low as thunder. "He'll try." For a long time, the only sound was the crack of firewood. Then Clara spoke again, softer now. "You should have left me. You don't owe me anything." Silas looked at her. Really looked. The bruises fading, the quiet strength in her eyes. The way she still held herself straight despite the weight she carried. "Maybe not," he said. "But I reckon I owe the world a few good deeds before I go. This one's as good a place as any to start." Days turned to a week. Clara began helping around the cabin, mending shirts, sweeping the floor, humming softly while she worked. The sound of her voice filled the lonely space with something Silas hadn't felt in years. Peace. He caught himself watching her sometimes. The way her hair caught the firelight, or the way her hands, scarred but gentle, moved when she made bread from the last of his flour. One evening, they sat by the creek watching the sunset bleed across the sky. The water glimmered red and gold. Clara hugged her knees, her voice barely above the sound of the current. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again." Silas leaned on his knees, staring at the horizon. Safety's a funny thing. Folks think it comes from walls and guns. Truth is, it comes from people you trust. She looked at him, studying the quiet lines of his face. "Do you trust anyone, Silas?" He chuckled low. "Ain't had much chance to. But I'm starting to." A long silence passed, heavy with unspoken things. Then she reached out, touching his hand lightly. "Thank you. For everything." He didn't move for a moment. Then he turned his hand over, letting her fingers rest against his palm. "Ain't done yet," he said softly. "Not till you're free." The air seemed to still between them. The last of the sunlight glowed against her face, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled, a small, fragile thing, but real. That night, as Silas lay awake listening to the creek outside and the soft rhythm of her breathing from across the cabin, he knew the truth he'd been avoiding. This woman had already changed him. The war had hardened him. The mountains had kept him alive, but she somehow had reminded him what he'd been fighting for all along. The mountains are quiet, but quiet never lasts. Clara had begun to settle into a fragile routine at Silas Boone's cabin, helping with chores, mending clothes, and even laughing softly at times. Small sounds that made the mountain air feel warmer. Silas, ever watchful, noticed the subtle changes. The way her shoulders relaxed as she chopped firewood. The way she moved with a little more confidence along the creek bank. The faintest spark in her green eyes when she spoke. But peace in the mountains is a fragile thing, and danger has a way of trailing the heels of those who think themselves safe. One late afternoon, as the sun dropped low behind the ridges, a rider appeared on the ridge above the cabin. a lone silhouette against the burning sky. Silas spotted him first, squinting against the sun. His hand went instinctively to his rifle. Clara, standing nearby, followed his gaze. Her lips parted, fear flashing in her eyes. "Is that—" He nodded. "McKinney, the man who had chained her in a barn, beaten her, and threatened her life himself." He rode alone at first, but Silas's sharp eyes saw 3 more men emerging from the forest below, friends or hired guns. The countenance of Eli McKinney was the same, cruel, confident, and drunk with the power he believed he wielded over everyone around him. Silas stepped between Clara and the cabin door, body tense. "Stay inside," he said, voice low but firm. "And don't make a sound." Clara's hands trembled at the doorknob. "I can't just hide." "You can," Silas said without anger, though his eyes blazed. "For now. This is my fight. You live to see it done." But Clara shook her head. "No, if I keep running, I'll never stop." "I'm done hiding." Silas looked at her, green eyes meeting gray. He had seen courage before, but hers was different. Not the reckless bravery of a gunfighter, but the quiet, steady fire of someone who had survived hell and refused to bow. He sighed, partly in admiration, partly in worry. "Then you'll fight with me." The men arrived at the cabin just as the sun kissed the last peaks. Eli McKinney's voice called out, loud, arrogant, and full of venom. "Come out, Boone. You think a mountain man can hide a woman from me? Hand her over or I'll burn this shack to the ground." Silas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. "She ain't yours to claim. Ride on, or answer for your sins." McKinney laughed, a harsh, grating sound that carried across the ridge. "We'll see who answers first." The gunfire erupted almost immediately. Bullets hissed through the air, splintering wood and striking the trees. Silas ducked behind a log pile, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Years of hunting, surviving harsh winters, and tracking predators had made him a lethal man in his element. Clara stayed inside the cabin at first, heart hammering against her ribs. Then she remembered Silas's words. "You live to see it done." Slowly she moved to the window, peeking out as one of McKinney's men tried to flank the cabin. Silas's eyes caught hers and he nodded once. That was all the encouragement she needed. Gripping a rifle she'd never held before, Clara took aim. The man raised his gun, confident, and she squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed through the trees. The man stumbled, then fell. For a brief moment, the air held stillness. Then the next volley of shots came, louder, closer. Silas barked instructions, directing her toward safer positions. Together they moved with a strange rhythm, instinctive and precise. Hunter and hunted in reverse, fighting off the men who thought themselves masters of the valley. Hours passed like minutes. Smoke filled the cabin. Dust mingled with the smell of gunpowder, and the last light of day faded into a moonlit night. Silas and Clara fought side by side, bodies tense, every sense alert. At last, Eli McKinney himself came close, brandishing a pistol, his arrogance unwavering even as the tide of battle turned against him. "You think a woman's life belongs to anyone but me?" he snarled. Silas stepped forward, revolver ready, voice calm but deadly. "She belongs to herself, McKinney. Ain't nobody else's choice to make." The gun flashed, and Eli's shoulder was grazed by a bullet. Pain twisted his face, but he didn't fall. He spat blood to the ground, fury contorting his features. "You've made a mistake, Boone, a mistake you'll pay for." Silas didn't flinch. "You already did. Every blow you struck her, every chain you put on her wrists, it's a debt you'll never repay. But you'll learn." Eli's men fled into the night after the second round of gunfire. Only he remained, weakened, angry, and broken in pride. Silas approached, not out of mercy, but because justice in the mountains isn't just about bullets. It's about standing over the man who's done wrong and telling him the world isn't his. "You're done," Silas said. "You'll never touch her again." Eli McKinney spat and glared, but he knew the truth. Silas had been right. The law down in town might be crooked, but here, in the wilderness, justice had a sharper edge. McKinney slunk away into the shadows, nursing wounds, swearing revenge that would never come. After the fight, Clara emerged from the cabin, shaking but alive. She approached Silas slowly, not speaking, just watching him, the man who had saved her life, who had given her a chance to fight back, who had treated her with more respect than any other human had in years. Silas lowered his rifle, exhaustion lining his face. His chest heaved, and yet there was a calmness in his eyes, the serenity of a man who had done what was necessary. Clara reached for his hand. Their fingers met, and for the first time since she had been freed, she felt truly safe. The mountain had a way of changing people, and in that moment she realized it had changed her too. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling. Silas shrugged, trying to hide the pride and warmth rising in his chest. "Ain't done yet. Just made sure you get to see another sunrise." They stood there for a long time, watching the moon climb over the peaks, the wind rustling through the pines. Every rustle, every shadow, reminded them of the danger that had passed, and the peace that now, for the first time, could be theirs. Clara knew she had survived the worst of human cruelty, and Silas knew he had saved more than a woman. He had saved a piece of his own humanity he thought he'd lost in the war and wilderness. The bond between them, forged in fire and fear, had grown into something unspoken but undeniable. It was quiet now. Too quiet for the valley, but perfect for the mountains. And in that silence, Silas and Clara understood the truth of the frontier. Freedom, trust, and love were treasures far rarer than gold or land, and they would fight together to keep them, no matter what shadows the world sent to their door. The morning after the fight left the mountains still and heavy with smoke. Silas Boone and Clara Bennett had survived, but the price of survival was clear in the dark bruises on her arms and the tension in Silas's jaw. They knew Eli McKinney wouldn't rest. A man like him didn't simply accept defeat. The mountain wind carried rumors. McKinney had friends in town, men who would gladly ride out and finish what he had started. Clara insisted they prepare. "We can't just wait for him," she said, voice firm, eyes blazing with a fire Silas had never seen before. He studied her for a moment. She was stronger than most women he'd known, stronger than many men. But the mountain hadn't made her ready for a siege. "Not yet. We'll fortify the cabin," Silas said.
"Set traps."
"If they come, they'll regret it." The next few days were a whirlwind of work. Silas taught Clara how to handle his rifle, to load the gun quickly, and to aim with care. He showed her how to listen to the wind, how to hear the subtle movements in the trees, how to spot danger in the brush before it reached them. At first, Clara's hands shook. Her pulse raced every time she pulled the trigger, even at the simple targets of tin cans or logs. But gradually her aim grew steady. Every lesson, every movement built her confidence and strengthened the bond between them. Evening came, and they would sit by the fire together. Sometimes Silas would talk about the mountains, about traps and tracking, and Clara would listen, absorbing every word. Other times the silence between them was enough, a quiet that needed no explanation, only presence. One night she touched his arm lightly. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above the whisper of the creek outside. Silas turned, eyes soft in the lamplight. "Ain't anything wrong with that. Scared keeps you alive, but fear don't get to rule you." Clara nodded, letting herself lean just slightly into his presence. The warmth of the cabin, the steady rhythm of the fire, and the quiet strength of the man before her made the terror outside seem almost distant. Then the attack came. 4 riders appeared at dusk, faces hidden by scarves and dust, rifles slung across their backs. Silas had anticipated the threat, yet even he felt the rush of adrenaline surge through his veins as the first shots rang out. "Inside," he shouted, diving behind a split-rail barricade. Clara followed instinctively, ducking low and keeping her rifle close. The attackers circled, trying to force them into the open. Splinters flew as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Smoke and dust filled the air, stinging Clara's eyes. Silas's voice was steady. "Watch the windows. Don't expose yourself." Together they moved as a unit. Silas would fire, then Clara would fire, covering each other as though they'd been partners for years. She felt a surge of pride, not just in herself, but in the man who had never let her face the danger alone. At one point, a rider tried to flank them. Clara remembered Silas's instructions and took aim. The rifle cracked, echoing through the ridge, and the man tumbled into the dirt. Silas shot the next one just as he lunged toward the cabin. The battle seemed endless. Smoke hung thick in the pines, fire licking the edges of the cabin from stray embers. Clara felt the heat on her face and arms, but fear had turned to fierce determination. This was no longer survival. It was reclaiming freedom. Finally, only Eli McKinney remained. Bloodied, angry, and wounded, he staggered toward the cabin. "You think you can keep her?" he spat, voice hoarse with rage. Silas stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, chest heaving but unbroken. "She's hers to keep, McKinney. Ain't nobody else's choice. Eli lunged and Silas fired, grazing his shoulder. Pain twisted McKinney's face, but his hatred remained unbroken. He raised his pistol again, aiming to finish the fight. Clara stepped forward. The sight of the man who had enslaved her, threatened her, beaten her. It sparked something fierce and undeniable. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder and the shot rang true. McKinney faltered, his gun hand shaking. Silas moved like a shadow, rifle raised, keeping the final threat at bay. The fight was over. The cabin lay in ruin, splintered wood, broken glass, and scorched earth, but inside a quiet settled. Clara sank to the floor, trembling, exhausted. Silas knelt beside her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, voice gentle, the hardness of battle softened by concern. "I am now," she whispered, leaning against him. Her hands traced the contours of his arm, and she felt the steady heartbeat beneath his chest. "Because you never let me face it alone." Silas's eyes softened. "Ain't done yet. Gotta rebuild. Gotta keep living." Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "Then let's do it together." In the days after the attack, they cleared the debris, repaired walls, and tended the small garden Silas had planted before she arrived. Every act of rebuilding felt symbolic, brick by brick, nail by nail. They were reconstructing not just the cabin, but their lives. At night, the firelight flickered across the room as they sat close together, Clara leaning against Silas, her head resting against his shoulder. She no longer flinched at his touch. Instead, she welcomed it. Every small gesture, a brush of fingers, a shared meal, a quiet laugh, carried the weight of trust and growing love. The mountains had tested them. The valley had tried to claim them. And yet, in the aftermath of chaos, something rare and beautiful had emerged. A love forged in fire, in fear, in survival, and in mutual respect. The wind howled outside, but inside, they were safe. Inside, they were together. And for the first time in months or years, Clara felt the weight of her chains fall away entirely. Autumn had arrived in the mountains, painting the peaks and valleys in gold, amber, and crimson. The air carried the crisp smell of pine needles and damp earth, and the rushing creek beside Silas Boone's cabin glittered with the reflection of the early sun. The cabin, once battered and scarred from gunfire and fire, now stood firm, its walls repaired and its hearth warm. Life had begun again. Slowly, deliberately, in the rhythm of the mountains. Clara Bennett stood on the small ridge above the cabin, looking down at the garden they had planted together. The tiny rows of vegetables were thriving despite the short growing season, and she felt a satisfaction she had never known. Here in this remote wilderness, she had not only survived, she had flourished. And beside her, always, was Silas, whose presence had become as steady and dependable as the mountains themselves. The journey to this point had not been easy. Clara had arrived at the cabin beaten, chained, and terrified, her trust shattered by men who saw her as nothing more than property. Silas had found her and carried her to safety, teaching her to survive, to defend herself, and, most importantly, to trust again. Over the months, they had faced the threat of Eli McKinney together, fought off his hired gunmen, and emerged stronger than ever. And now, in the quiet aftermath, their bond had grown into something neither of them could deny, a deep, enduring love. Clara turned to Silas as he mended the roof, the boards creaking under his careful hands. "I never imagined I could feel this way," she said softly, her voice carrying on the cool autumn breeze. "Safe, free, happy." Silas paused, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes meeting hers. The corners of his weathered face softened, revealing the faintest trace of a smile. "Ain't that the truth?" he said. "The mountains don't give much, but what they do give, it's worth fighting for." She smiled back, and for a moment they simply stood together, letting the silence and the crisp mountain air speak for itself. It was a silence full of understanding, trust, and love, a language that needed no words. In the days that followed, they made plans for the future. They rode into the nearest town together to trade for supplies and to buy 2 new horses. The townsfolk had heard the stories, the wild mountain man, the woman he had saved. But what they didn't know was the depth of the bond between them, the respect and trust that had grown in the harshest conditions imaginable. When they returned to the cabin, Silas and Clara spent the evenings teaching each other new skills. Silas showed her how to track game deeper into the woods, how to read the signs of the seasons, and how to know when a predator was near. Clara taught Silas how to cook with herbs she had learned to forage, how to prepare the garden for winter, and even how to mend the soft linens she had brought from the valley. Their lessons were never just practical. They were acts of trust, collaboration, and intimacy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the distant ridges, Clara and Silas sat on the porch, watching the golden light spill across the valley. Silas passed her a cup of tea, and she accepted it with a quiet, grateful smile. The air was filled with the scent of pine smoke and fresh soil, and for the first time in years, both of them felt a sense of completeness. Clara rested her head against Silas's shoulder. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if you hadn't found me?" she asked softly. He chuckled, a deep, low sound that rumbled through his chest. "Ain't something I like to imagine," he said. "Guess I'd still be wandering the ridges, wondering if anyone ever needed me." She tilted her head to look up at him, her green eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "Well, you did find me," she said gently. "And now, I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Silas's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Ain't nothing perfect," he said, "but what we got, it's as close as it comes." Winter crept in over the mountains, bringing snow that blanketed the valley in silence and frost. Clara and Silas worked together to prepare for the season, stacking firewood, fortifying the cabin, and tending to the animals. Nights were long, but they spent them together by the fire, sharing stories, hopes, and quiet laughter. The hardships of the past had forged a bond that neither fire, nor cold nor time could break. One night, as the wind howled through the pines and the snow fell thick and fast, Clara looked across the fire at Silas. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with both hope and vulnerability. Silas met her gaze, his eyes steady and unwavering. "I reckon we will. You and me, Clara. We're stronger together than apart. Whatever comes, we'll face it side by side." Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, but from a sense of profound relief. For the first time in her life, she felt truly safe, truly loved, and truly free. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. The fire crackled, the snow swirled outside, and inside the cabin the world was warm, safe, and theirs. Spring returned to the mountains, and with it, a sense of renewal. The garden blossomed, the creek ran clear and strong, and the cabin stood firm, a testament to resilience and love. Silas and Clara rode their new horses together, exploring the ridges and valleys, laughing as they raced along the trails, feeling the wind on their faces. Every step, every ride, every shared moment was a promise, a commitment to a life built together. One evening, they rode to the highest ridge overlooking the valley where Silas had first found her. Clara dismounted, brushing snow from her coat, and stood beside him, gazing at the mountains. "We came a long way," she said softly. Silas put an arm around her shoulders. "Ain't finished yet," he said. "But yeah, we've come a long way, and whatever comes next, we face it together." They stood in silence, watching the sun set over the peaks, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples. In that quiet, Clara realized something she hadn't known she'd been searching for all her life, a place where she truly belonged. And beside her, Silas, rugged, steady, and loyal, was home. The months that followed were peaceful, full of hard work and shared joys. Clara and Silas built a life together in the mountains, each day deepening their bond. They shared laughter, labor, and quiet evenings by the fire, and in each other's company they discovered something neither had expected. A love born from survival, forged in adversity and strengthened by trust and respect. One evening, as they watched the sun dip behind the peaks, Clara rested her hand on Silas's chest. "I never thought I'd find this," she said. "A life that feels like it belongs to me." Silas smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "It's yours," he said simply. "And mine. All of it, together." As the stars emerged above the mountains, Clara leaned against him and Silas held her close. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the promise of countless tomorrows. The mountain man who had walked into a barn to buy a horse had found something far rarer: a woman's courage, a love strong enough to endure, and a new beginning where freedom, trust, and life itself could flourish. And in the heart of the wild Montana mountains, they had found home, together.